Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to the annual Richard W. Smith Lecture in Civil War History. We look forward to this evening each year as we have the opportunity to bring speakers to campus to help us reflect upon the period of the Civil War, or just before or just after that period, and also to honor the legacy of Dr. Richard Smith. I always am inspired by the number of the former students of Dr. Smith who returned for this lecture. And so I'd like to ask you, if you were a student of Dick Smith, would you stand so we can just see how many of those former students are in the room this evening? How about that? Now let's have a little fun. I won't ask you to stand, but if you wish you had been a former student of Dr. Smith, would you put your hand in the air? Yes, yeah. So we honor Dr. Smith and his legacy as a teacher and a member of this faculty, as a scholar of the Civil War. I was in Chicago last night for a campaign dinner related to the Connect Today, Create Tomorrow campaign with a group of alumni from Ohio Wesleyan. And over the course of the dinner, the people at the table were talking about the faculty who had had such an impact on them during their time here. And of course, among the first names to be called was the name of Dick Smith. 3 weeks ago tonight, Melissa and I were in Albany, New York for a campaign dinner related to the Connect Today, Create Tomorrow campaign with 7 or 8 alumni plus their spouses at dinner. And in that setting, again, with a heavy number of alumni from the 60s and early 70s, as they reflected on their time here at Ohio Wesleyan and on the faculty who had such an impact on them. Among the first names to be called was the name of Dick Smith. For those of you who do not know Dick, he devoted his life to the study of the Civil War and to the teaching the lessons and the history of that war to his students. Some of those students, including some who are here this evening, have devoted their lives to the full-time study of history. Others have taken the lessons learned about the Civil War and from history with them into the study of law, or into corporate and business leadership, or into public education, or into a variety of other fields of service in this society, exuding, really, in the most remarkable ways, the full value of a liberal arts education as it is reflected in the study of history. So, Dick, we thank you for your legacy, and we look forward each year to this opportunity to continue to learn more about the Civil War and its impact on our society, and for the second year in a row, to be able to reflect upon the 14th Amendment, which came just after the Civil War and which has shaped so much of the structure of our democratic society for the last 150 years. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, and now to introduce the chair of the Department of History and last year's Smith lecturer, Dr. Barbara Tershing. Barb.
Well, I was actually the Vogel lecturer in the spring, but that's okay. Maybe I'll be a future Smith lecturer. Who knows? Let me welcome you on behalf of the History Department. And I'm going to, of course, extend a big thanks to the former students, our alums, who have so generously donated to this fantastic lecture series. So thank you so much. But I must, of course, thank Dick and Betty. Dick and Betty, would you stand, please? Oh, I don't want to make you stand, but yeah, stand, please. Because, of course, it is because of Dick's inspiration of these students in the classroom. But I know from all the stories that Betty was also very much part of them feeling welcome and a great, not alternative to Dick, but a great compliment. Let me say compliment to Dick. So, thank you to the alums, the donors, and thank you to Dick and Betty Smith. I also do want to thank Ms. Dawn Wright of the History Department, because all of the logistics of this, she's just worked really, really hard on that. So please recognize Ms. Dawn Wright for me. Thank you. I am the person who teaches the Civil War and Reconstruction class. Fortunately, I did not have to follow Dick. There was a gap. Can you imagine trying to follow in Dick's footsteps? Impossible, of course. But so for me, this lecture series, I get personal pleasure out of it because I get to meet the top-notch, nationally recognized experts. I too learn from them. I don't know it all. Oh, I didn't go on record saying that, did I? And then also, though, my students, they come into my class the next day, and so tomorrow, my Civil War class gets to meet with this nationally recognized expert. So I've enjoyed every single year. This year, though, I have been really looking forward to this year. It's been planned for a while. Well, why? Because 2018 is the 150th anniversary, I like to say birthday, happy birthday, to the 14th Amendment, so 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment. And so the topic is near and dear to my heart. My students know that, those of you who know me know that, it's very important to me. I think, as Lincoln said, it really reflects the better angels of our nature. So that's one reason I've been looking forward to it. But I've also been looking forward to it because of who our speaker is tonight. Now, of course, he is a nationally recognized expert in legal and constitutional history, particularly an expert on the Civil War and Reconstruction. If you look at your programs, it shows you just some of his books. It mentions he's the author of 45 essays. It tells you that he has been a leader in his profession in terms of service as well. But that's kind of true of every speaker. Here's why I've really been excited about Dr. Benedict being the speaker tonight. He is my Professor Smith. He is my mentor and the person who guided me. He is quite literally the reason that I stand here in front of you as the chair of the history department at Ohio Wesleyan. Now, Dick, I want you to pay attention to this. I think you had it easier than Dr. Benedict had, because after all, you were teaching 18 to 20-year-olds, very impressionable young undergraduates. What does the word impressionable mean? Easy to impress. Whereas Dr. Benedict saw in his classroom a 40-something, somewhat cynical, dispirited civil rights lawyer who was considering stopping the practice of law, which was very meaningful, doing civil rights work, but stopping it to become a teacher at the college level. So I took a class with him. This is how I met him. I took a continuing education class at Ohio State University. Now, it was graded. It wasn't pass-fail. And at the end, you had to write a research paper on an important Supreme Court case. So I wrote my paper, and he gave it back. That's when I became impressed. He gave me an A+. That's impressive! But I'm teasing, of course, because the most important thing was what he also wrote on it. It changed my life. He said, first-rate, analytical job. Do you have plans for graduate school? I hope so. I know, isn't that sweet? It's true. So anyway, that's why I'm particularly happy to have you join me in welcoming Professor Benedict tonight to speak about the truly transformative 14th Amendment. Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of wonderful reasons to speak tonight, to be honored to speak. It's such an honor to come and speak at the Smith Lecture. A man who knows incredible amounts of the Civil War, who's so well known for teaching it, whose students show such obvious affection and respect for him here. But of course, one of the most wonderful reasons to give a talk like this is the introduction. Thank you, Barb. It's going to take a while to actually recover from that introduction and get into the talk. I want to echo all the thanks that other people have given, and especially to Dawn Wright, who did so much logistically to help me manage here. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 14th Amendment. The last of the 28 states needed to approve it acted on July 9th, 1868, and Secretary of State William Henry Seward formally announced the ratification on July 28th. It was a momentous event, a change to our constitutional system so fundamental that historians have put it on a par with the ratification of the original document itself. The 14th Amendment was designed to be a basis for the restoration of the union of the states that had, with the state, restoration to the union of the states that had attempted to secede. It was framed by members of the Union Party that were the overwhelming majority in Congress. The Union Party was made up both of Republicans and war Democrats who had joined them in support of the Union, as contrast to other Democrats, both peace Democrats and semi-war Democrats, who had opposed them. If the seceding states ratified the 14th Amendment and conformed their state constitutions to its provisions, Congress would recognize their restoration to normal relations in the Union. And as those of you who've studied Reconstruction know, it took a lot of prodding, and there was a lot of violence, and it was a very tense and difficult period in American history before the southern states agreed to do it. But in the end, all of the seceding states complied under a good deal of coercion. The amendment consisted of 5 sections. Let's not try to read them, or that's all we'll do for the rest of the evening, but I did want to give you a sense of what it looked like. The first section defined for the first time who were citizens, and it forbade states from denying the rights of citizenship or other basic rights. And that is the section that is most relevant today, and we're going to come back to it. The second section adjusted how representation would be apportioned in the House of Representatives and therefore, in consequence, in the Electoral College. And that adjustment was necessary because under the Constitution, apportionment was based on the population of all persons, all free persons, and 3/5 of other persons. Constitution never mentioned slavery. Everybody knew who the other persons were. The problem was, of course, that with the abolition of slavery, it would now be whole population. All free persons would be counted, and there'd be a big increase in the representation of the South in Congress and the Electoral College at the very time that they had tried to destroy the Union. So they changed the system to approximate a bit more of voters, a new formula. And that formula made sure that a state did not get credit for classes of the adult male population that it disfranchised. The third section disqualified Confederates from holding state or federal offices if they had once taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, and they would remain disqualified until Congress removed the disability. The fourth section guaranteed payment of the debts the United States had incurred in suppressing the rebellion, and forbade the payments of those incurred by the Confederacy. And then the fifth section empowered Congress to pass laws appropriate to enforce the other provisions. So most of the provisions of the 14th Amendment are not very relevant to us today. The ones that are most relevant are in the first section. When constitutional historians say that the 14th Amendment transformed the United States Constitution, we're referring to those provisions. The Civil War worked a fundamental change in American society. It changed the United States from a slaveholding republic to a free republic. And the 14th Amendment transformed the Constitution to reflect this fundamental change and to make sure that the federal government had the constitutional power to enforce the change. For the first time, Americans would be able to look to their national government to protect their rights. And one has to think about that for a moment. In the Declaration of Independence, it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That is why we have government, to protect our rights. And before the Civil War, it was not the federal government that protected your rights. It was the state government that protected your rights. So this is a tremendous transition in our system. The great historian Don Fehrenbacher provided a basis for understanding the transformation wrought by the Civil War in a book aptly titled The Slave-Holding Republic. He distinguished between slave societies, where slavery is central to the social system and the legal system, as in the southern states, and slave-holding societies, whose laws accommodated slavery without making it society's central institution. Before the Civil War, the United States was at least the latter, a slave-holding society, and many Northerners feared that it was sliding towards the former, a slave society. Slavery had become a vibrant, profitable institution, spreading quickly to new territories that then became states. At the same time, the United States was becoming a much more completely integrated country. Transportation facilities, communications facilities, and financial institutions were tying us together ever more tightly. And this integration meant that an Ohioan could own human beings at a distance, buying and selling them in Mississippi, say, without leaving Ohio, treating them as investments or as enslaved workers on a plantation that could be administered remotely. He, or more rarely she, could enforce her property rights in human beings, the right to buy, sell, or rent them, to maintain ownership in the face of a rival claim, not only in the courts of Mississippi, but in the courts of the United States, which were obligated to apply Mississippi law in their own proceedings when a case arose in Mississippi. He or she would be able to mortgage that human property, to use them as collateral for debt, just like a Mississippian could. The time was coming when a New Yorker would be able to transfer ownership of a slave in Alabama to a purchaser living in Illinois. The agreement would be enforced in the courts of the United States, which the Constitution authorized to decide disputes between citizens of different states. That is why the United States stood as a precipice. That's why Lincoln said in 1858 that the Union could no longer endure half slave and half free, that it must become all one or all the other. When more and more Northerners demanded that something be done to stop the transformation of the United States into a fully slave society, Southerners accused them of violating a constitution, the United States Constitution, that treated human property like any other property. To understand the way the 14th Amendment transformed that Constitution, one has to know something about the American constitutional system that characterized a slave-holding republic. The Constitution, framed in 1787 and ratified in 1788, accommodated slavery. It had to. The framers knew that Southerners would never ratify the Constitution if the stronger federal government it created threatened slavery. So everyone agreed that the abolition of slavery was up to each state, that it would not be a matter for the federal government. The federal government would have only the powers that the Constitution delegated to it, and regulation of slavery was not among them. As I said, the Constitution nowhere mentioned slavery. That was because the framers expected the states to abolish it in the foreseeable future. Why sully the document with a reference to an institution so at odds with the founding principles expressed in the Declaration of Independence? Nonetheless, accommodating slavery required some provisions protecting the interests of the slave states and slaveholders. The provision abortioning representation in the House of Representatives, and therefore the Electoral College that I just mentioned, was based on the number of free persons and 3/5 of other persons of each state. The more slaves, the greater the representation. Another provision accommodating slavery was what came to be known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. Although it never mentioned the word slave, it specified that a person held to service or labor in a slave state would not become free by escaping to a free one. It required that the fugitive be delivered up to the person, quote, to whom such service or labor was due. There had been no such provision in the Articles of Confederation, which had preceded the Constitution. So advocates of ratification of the Constitution in the South could rightly say that the Constitution provided a better safeguard for slave owners than what had existed previously. Other provisions provided new safeguards too. For example, the Constitution obligated the federal government to help suppress domestic insurrections in any state that occurred. In the South, that meant help to put down slave rebellions. These concessions seemed reasonable as long as slavery appeared to be on the way out. And until the 1830s, that seemed to be what the future held. One state after another provided for immediate or gradual emancipation. Culminate one after another, down the list, what was called the East in those days rather than the North, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, down Pennsylvania, and then down to New York, down to New Jersey, and finally by the 1830s, Virginia in 1832. But that effort was defeated. And it was defeated because of a change in the value of slaves, and the effort was never made again in any of the southern states. With the invention of the cotton gin, plantation agriculture became extremely lucrative, boosting the value not only of the land on which you grew cotton, but the slaves who provided the plantation workforce. And it was one thing to free slaves who were an economic burden to their owners, and it was something completely different to free slaves whose value was growing and whose labor was essential to the new and growing prosperity of the South. In these circumstances, it was not enough for slaveholders that the Constitution merely accommodated slavery. From the 1830s on, they interpreted the Constitution to protect slavery. They argued that the compromise over slavery in 1787 was the heart of the Constitution, more important even than the agreement to strengthen the federal government. And the heart of that compromise, they insisted, was an agreement to immunize slavery from federal action. Even where the Constitution delegated power to Congress, that power could not be used in a way that harmed slavery. Actually, Southerners went further. It was not enough that the Constitution left the slavery question to the states alone. They argued that Northerners should not criticize slavery, should not urge Southerners to abolish it. Such criticism violated the spirit of the Constitution, they argued. They warned that if remaining in the Union did threaten slavery, Southerners could and would withdraw from it. And they interpreted the Constitution to permit such a secession. These threats powerfully affected the way Northerners interpreted the constitutional system. They loved the Constitution, and they loved the Union. They took Southern threats very seriously. It became commonplace for Northerners to agree that the Constitution would never have been ratified without concessions to the South. Most agreed that maintaining cordial feelings towards slaveholders was crucial to maintaining the Union itself, and that made most Northerners especially hostile to abolitionists. In the 1830s, Northern community leaders called public meetings to formally condemn abolitionist action. Here's an example. This was a poster. Outrage, fellow citizens, an abolitionist of the most revolting character is among you, exciting the feelings of the North against the South. He's to deliver a seditious lecture this evening at 7 o'clock in the Presbyterian Church. They give him the address. You are requested to attend and unite in putting down and silencing by peaceable means this tool of evil and fanaticism. Let the rights of the states guaranteed by the Constitution be protected. Of course, the putting down was often not peaceable. These kinds of posters often led to riots aimed not only at abolitionists, but at free black communities in the North. Among the worst were those that took place in Cincinnati, in Ohio. Abolitionist presses and newspapers were destroyed, publishing houses were burned down, abolitionist meetings were broken up. This was the mobbing of William Lloyd Garrison, who's there in the center, by people in Boston. This is a poster or an illustration that is sympathetic to the people who mobbed him. Notice they're all dressed as gentlemen. They're in top hats. They're in frock coats. He, of course, they're manhandling him out, and he seems a kind of at a loss. They're carrying canes. They're hounding. So this represents the feelings in the North. A number of abolitionists were killed, as were many more African Americans. Newspapers regularly denounced abolitionists as foes of the Constitution, especially after Garrison and his allies, a minority among abolitionists, openly denounced it. And this was the informal constitutional context of the slaveholding republic, what constitutional historians call popular constitutionalism, the beliefs about the Constitution that are widely held among the people. And within that context, you had the more formal interpretations of a constitution that sustained a slaveholding republic. Now, in the slaveholding republic, Americans tried to accommodate the radical differences between the free states and the slave states by stressing state rights. The Constitution establishes a federal system in which the central or federal government exercises certain powers and the rest are reserved to the states. The existence of slavery in half the states gave a special edge to that principle. At the heart of state rights was the conviction that the Constitution treated slavery as a matter reserved entirely to the states. Most of all, in a slaveholding republic, the federal government could not be given the job of protecting the rights of individual people within the states. Protecting people from their neighbors, settling their disputes, this was, as the Declaration of Independence says, the main purpose of government, and it was reserved to the states, not to the federal government, and how the states did it was up to them. That created a somewhat anomalous position for courts. They're not the courts as we think of them today. The framers of the Constitution had struggled with how to make sure that the states would conform to the Constitution's requirements. James Madison had suggested at the Constitutional Convention that Congress be given the power to veto state laws that violated the Constitution. But the other framers had rejected that idea. They didn't want to give Congress the power to enforce compliance. That was too much like the power the British had claimed for Parliament. And the answer they came up with was ingenious. They declared that the Constitution was the supreme law of the land, and that when cases came before them, state judges would have to enforce that Constitution regardless of any state law to the contrary. And then the very first Congress authorized the United States Supreme Court to hear appeals from cases in which those state judges had upheld the state laws against a constitutional challenge. So if the Constitution established any right that states could not interfere with, the judges, and in the end, the justices of the Supreme Court, would have the power to enforce them. But the last thing that Southern slaveholders wanted was to have a federal court, the Supreme Court of the United States, define and protect the rights of the residents of their states. By its nature, the slave system was not one that protected individual rights. From the 1830s on, the slave states made it more and more difficult even for white people to criticize slavery. They prosecuted such critics, driving some of them out of their states. No northern opponent of slavery could hope to go to the South to try to convince them to abolish slavery. They'd be prosecuted, maybe lynched. All abolitionists could do was to send anti-slavery pamphlets and newspapers. Southern legislatures made it illegal to distribute such anti-slavery literature, and they tried to extradite the authors of that literature from the northern states to face prosecution in the South. Southern postmasters refused to deliver anti-slavery material in the mail. The Southern legislatures were especially hard on free black Southerners. The very existence of a free black population seemed inconsistent with a system of slavery based on race. Southern legislatures refused to consider free African Americans among them to be citizens. They were identified instead as free persons of color. That was the formal legal term. The slave codes had provisions applying to free persons of color, denying them all kinds of rights. White Southerners always suspected that free black people among them were fomenting slave resistance. So the slave codes forbade them from carrying weapons or gathering in groups. They were required to carry papers attesting to their freedom, and slave patrols constantly stopped and checked them. By the 1850s, some Southern states were considering expelling them altogether. Now, all of this was inconsistent with the Bill of Rights that Americans had attached to the Constitution in 1791. These laws infringed the freedom of speech and press protected by the First Amendment. The Fifth Amendment said that no person could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. How could that be reconciled with slavery? How could that be reconciled with the laws limiting the rights of free black Southerners in other ways? Well, what were the judges to do? No one wanted them to declare slavery unconstitutional as a violation of the Fifth Amendment. No one wanted them to test the constitutionality of Southern laws protecting slavery from criticism or controlling the free black population. Northerners understood the kind of crisis such judicial interference would precipitate. Well, the Supreme Court provided the answer in an important case decided in 1833. It was called Balt Baron versus Baltimore. It held that the Bill of Rights simply did not apply to the states. Its provisions applied only to the federal government. If the Constitution meant to limit the way a state could exercise its reserved power, the Supreme Court said, the Constitution had to say so explicitly, like it did in Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. That section said, no state shall enter into treaties, coin money, pass bills of attainder, declare a person, that bill of attainder, by the way, means declaring a person an outlaw just by an act, or impair the obligation of a contract. Judges could enforce those restrictions, the Supreme Court said, because it says no state shall do these things. But the Bill of Rights had no such language. So it didn't apply to the states. So the main mechanism the framers of the Constitution had provided for enforcing the Constitution did hardly anything to stop states from depriving people of rights. Well, there was one place in the Constitution that did seem to impose some limit on states' power to deny civil liberties. Article 4 of the Constitution says that the citizen of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. That meant a couple of things. First, citizens of one state could visit another state and engage in all the ordinary activities that citizens did there: buy and sell property, make contracts, go to court to protect their property, and enforce those contracts. That visitor was entitled to the protection of the laws. But it meant something more. If citizens of one state moved to another state, he or she was entitled to all the rights the citizens enjoyed there. The framers of the Constitution didn't want Alabama to forbid Yankees from moving to Alabama. or anybody else. So that's the other meaning of the Privileges and Immunities Clause. But when it came to black Americans, states both North and South seemed to violate that clause. Many northern states and every southern state banned free persons of color from immigrating into their states. Negro Seamen laws, they were called, S-E-A-M-A-N. Negro Seamen laws forbade black sailors on ships from northern states from setting foot in southern harbors because Southerners thought they were particularly dangerous. They had to either stay on their ship or they would have to be put in jail while they were in the southern port. Now, the problem when that happens is that those sailors, many of them were on ships from Rhode Island and Massachusetts. They had the largest fleets in the United States. Those states explicitly considered their black residents to be citizens. So this is a clear violation of the Privileges and Immunities Clause. So how could southern states do it? How could states adopt constitutions or pass laws that barred free black people from settling there, in some cases even visiting? Shouldn't judges have held such laws and constitutional provisions unconstitutional? But when a Massachusetts lawyer went to Charleston, South Carolina to challenge the constitutionality of that state's Negro Seamen law in a federal court, the city's leaders warned him to leave. They would not be able to protect him from a mob, they warned. Of course, what they meant was that they would encourage the mob. The lawyer left. State judges sustained the constitutionality of those kinds of laws by holding that the Privileges and Immunities Clause applied only to those who were both citizens of their states and citizens of the United States. And then they denied that any person of African descent could be a citizen of the United States, no matter what their state said. Therefore, this provision didn't protect them, apply to them. And the United States Supreme Court sustained that position in its famous or infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857. It held that no person of African descent was entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. And it was a perfect example, perfect declaration, rather, of constitutional law for a slaveholding republic. So although the framers had designated the courts to be the main enforcers of the Constitution, the judges had carefully limited how they fulfilled that responsibility. They had struck down laws impairing the obligation of contracts. They'd struck down a few state interferences with interstate and foreign commerce. But they had done little to protect civil rights and liberties. How could they? Slavery constituted the most pervasive deprivation of civil liberty in American history. Courts could not protect civil liberty without threatening the foundations of the slaveholding republic. And as a result, courts played a relatively minor role in the pre-Civil War constitutional system, and they were certainly not the guardians of civil rights. Well, what about Congress? The framers had refused to give it a general veto power over state violations of the Constitution. It had no power to enforce the Bill of Rights against state infringements, but could it enforce the Privileges and Immunities Clause? None but a few abolitionists thought so. It was not among the express powers delegated in Article 1, and no such language appeared in Article 4. But there were Northerners who said at least Congress should not admit any new state into the Union if its proposed constitution barred black citizens of other states from moving there. We might not be able to enforce it, but we don't have to let a state in that does it. And one of the strongest opponents of admitting Oregon into the Union with such a constitutional provision in 1859 was a congressman from Cadiz, Ohio, named John A. Bingham. And Bingham delivered the longest, most thoughtful speech on the subject. States could regulate the political rights of citizenship, he conceded, but they could not deprive citizens of the basic rights of life, liberty, and property. The Constitution did not give Congress the power to nullify such unconstitutional deprivations, he conceded, but he would never vote to admit a new state that so palpably violated the Constitution. Well, in the 1850s, the consensus that sustained the slaveholding republic's interpretation of the Constitution crumbled in the North. Opponents of slavery finally broke through that consensus and organized the Republican Party. But it was not the violation of the rights of African Americans that precipitated the change. Only when many Northerners began to see the slaveholding republic as a threat to their own futures and prosperity did anti-slavery constitutionalism gain traction. The main issue was Southerners' insistence that the Constitution guaranteed the right to take their slave property into all the territories of the United States. Opponents of slavery warned what everybody knew, that no slave territory had ever entered the Union as a free state. Acquiescing in slaveholders' demand for access to all the territories inevitably meant the exclusion of free labor from all those territories. The Southern demand for access to all the territories of the United States demonstrated how potent and vital slavery was. It was not dying. It was expanding. It was no longer enough for the Constitution merely to accommodate slavery, to tolerate it. Slavery was part and parcel of American life, slaveholders insisted. And the Constitution had to recognize that fact. And most Northerners recoiled from that idea. When Southerners warned that they would leave a Union and Constitution that failed to protect their rights, most Northerners decided to take the risk. The demand for free soil in the territories finally led to the creation of that anti-slavery Republican Party. The Republicans challenged the constitutional doctrines that lay at the foundation of the slaveholding republic. They insisted that Americans had understood the Constitution in light of the Declaration of Independence when they ratified it. It was a constitution for a country based on the idea that all men had a natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the purpose of government was to secure those rights. The Constitution had accommodated the reality of slavery, but it promised nothing more. It treated slavery as a local state institution, while freedom was national. That became the slogan of the Republican Party, and it's inherently a constitutional slogan, and it was most popularized by an Ohioan, Senator Salmon P. Chase, who made a great speech titled Freedom National, Slavery Local in 1851. Where the Constitution delegated power to Congress, Chase said, that power was dedicated to freedom and could never be used to promote slavery. African Americans were citizens of the United States, no matter what the Supreme Court said, entitled to basic rights and the protection of the laws. Southerners saw the triumph of the Republicans in 1860 as a repudiation of the Constitution as they understood it, the Constitution of a slave-holding republic. They attempted to secede and establish their own slave-holding republic, actually their own slave republic. And the defeat of the Confederacy meant that Southerners were going to have to live in a republic dedicated to freedom. But Republicans were not so sure that that was going to be the case at the time. Although they had won the war, Republicans could not be sure that their vision of the Constitution of freedom was firmly established. Throughout the war, Democrats had argued for, as they said, preserving the Constitution as it is and the Union as it was. In 1864, that became the Democratic Party's slogan, and somebody made up a song that Democrats could sing to remind themselves and tell everybody else what their slogan was. Democrats had lost the elections during the Civil War, but they remained potent, and so did some major elements of the slaveholding Constitution. And the most potent of those elements was the continued beliefs that African Americans were not entitled to the rights of citizenship and that the power to determine their status remained with the states and not the federal government. The Democratic Party remained committed to that view, and so it turned out did Andrew Johnson, who succeeded to the presidency when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So because they were not certain that their anti-slavery interpretations of the Constitution had been fully and permanently established, Republicans determined to write the constitutional transformation into the Constitution itself. That would be part of the deal Southerners would have to accept in exchange for restoration to their normal relations in the Union. And Ohioans took the lead. A first step, of course, was the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, which was managed through the House of Representatives by Toledo's Congressman James M. Ashley. But the amendment did not itself answer the questions raised by emancipation. What would be the status of the freed slaves? Would they be citizens? What rights would they have? Who would protect those rights, and how? You can see from the language of the 13th Amendment that Republicans did not have much faith in judges to enforce the Constitution against state violations. Why would they, given their past record? The amendment was framed as an explicit denial that states could support slavery. Surely a judge would rule a state law literally attempting to reinstitute slavery unconstitutional under this provision of the Constitution. But could one rely on the courts to define whether former slaves were citizens? Could one rely on them to strike down discriminatory laws? Clearly, Republicans didn't think so. So they made clear what had been left out of previous provisions regarding civil liberty. They expressly gave Congress the power to enforce the amendment by appropriate legislation. And within a few months of the 13th Amendment's ratification, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared all persons born in the United States citizens and gave them the same basic rights held by white citizens. But they didn't leave it to the courts. They had passed a law. But Bingham, the other Ohioan, was not satisfied. In fact, he was one of the very few Republicans who voted against the Civil Rights Act. He did not think that mere abolition of slavery could be interpreted to give the rights of citizenship to former slaves. And he was very worried that the Supreme Court would adhere to its Dred Scott precedent and rule the Civil Rights Act unconstitutional. Well, Bingham was now a senior member of Congress, appointed to the Joint Congressional Committee designated to establish the terms of Reconstruction. And he persuaded his colleagues to recommend another constitutional amendment. And here it is. Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to secure the citizens of each state, all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and to all persons in the several states equal protection in the rights of life, liberty, and property. So you can see Bingham focused on the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the original Constitution, which had led him to vote against the admission of Oregon into the Union. The courts had done nothing to enforce that clause against state laws violating it. And clearly Bingham didn't expect them to do anything to do so in the future. His answer was to give that power expressly to Congress. But his proposal met a barrage of criticism. If taken to its extreme, it would authorize Congress to protect every person's life, liberty, and property from infringements by anyone. That had always been the job of the states. To give that fundamental responsibility to the federal government would destroy federalism itself. Now, Bingham actually, in the debate, made clear that this is not what he intended. He only intended to give Congress the power to counteract state laws that deprive their people of their rights. But that went too far for his colleagues, too. That was exactly the power the framers of the Constitution had refused to give Congress back in 1787 when Madison proposed it. When his fellow Republicans postponed further consideration of his proposal, which in effect meant they were defeating it, Bingham saw the light. He'd reframe the amendment to make sure judges would have the power to enforce it. And so now you know why the first section of the 14th Amendment reads the way that it does. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the states in which they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law that shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall a state deny to any person the equal protections of the law. But Bingham did not mean to give the courts the sole power to enforce the amendment. The 14th Amendment also included the fifth section. Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. In later years, Bingham insisted that he intended this section to give Congress the same general power to protect civil liberties when states failed to do so that his first version did. But he left the provision giving Congress that power dangling at the end. It's the fifth section. There are three other sections between that first section and that section. It seems almost an afterthought. And ultimately, it was not as important a part of the transformation of American constitutionalism as he intended. So here was the transformation that the 14th Amendment made in the constitutional system. It defined citizenship so that every person born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction was a citizen. No longer was that status limited to white people, nor could it be limited by any other characteristic. It gave the federal government a new power to define and protect the rights of the people of the United States and all who resided in the country. The federal government would now perform what the Declaration of Independence said was the very purpose of government, to protect people in their rights. But the enforcement mechanism turned out to be court decisions, not generally acts of Congress. The amendment transformed the role of the courts, and at the top of the judicial system, it transformed the role of the Supreme Court. It made clear that judges had a responsibility to protect the rights of the American people. If states violated those rights, the courts were to intervene. And so the 14th Amendment imposed a counter-majoritarian obligation on the judges to protect individual and minority rights against laws passed by the majority in any state. And over time, this change was so profound that it encouraged the Supreme Court to undertake the same role with regard to the federal government. Before the Civil War, the Supreme Court rarely pronounced an act of Congress unconstitutional. After the war, it became more common, and nowadays, everyone concedes that the court can exercise its counter-majoritarian mandate against decisions made by Congress, as well as the states. Well, the Smith Lectures are intended to deal with the Civil War era with which Professor Smith was so closely identified. So I'll simply say that this change in the role of the courts did not happen overnight. The Supreme Court at first resisted taking on this new role under the 14th Amendment. It finally did so not to protect the individual rights, the civil rights that Bingham and the Republicans had hoped, but rather property rights. But it did finally come to enforce, one after another, of the provisions of the Bill of Rights against state infringement. It took a central role in the great civil rights revolution of the 20th century. And now the court sees, the justices see, the definition and protection of the rights and liberties as its most important function. For good or ill, the central role of the court has become a defining element of the American constitutional system. As Charles Evans Hughes said, even before he became Chief Justice, we are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is. And here's an image of how we view the Constitution many times a day. You see "We the People," the Constitution in the background. There is the Supreme Court building superimposed on it, and there are the scales of justice. We think so much of the Constitution as being the property of the courts. So the 14th Amendment marked the transformation of the Constitution from the fundamental law of a slaveholding republic to a free one. And it made the courts, especially the Supreme Court, the protector of our freedoms. But one of the consequences has been to relieve the American people of much of our sense of our own responsibility for maintaining a free society. The opponents of slavery took that responsibility on themselves in an era when control of the Supreme Court, in an era when the courts evaded it. My point is that, of course, that this whole transformation took place because people rejected the idea that the courts had the final say of the Constitution. Now we live in an era when control of the Supreme Court seems more important than control of the government itself. Only now are we coming to realize that the 14th Amendment may have led us to put too much responsibility for freedom on the courts and too little on ourselves. Thank you.
Professor Mike Flam's going to do the honor of taking the microphone around to people who have questions. Who would like to ask a question?
One in the corner here.
Over there? All right. Section 1 doesn't explicitly mention the role of the federal courts. Was that understood? And is that perhaps a reason, the lack of mention of that, was that perhaps a reason it took so long for the courts to embrace the role?
I don't think that's the reason. The courts are established in the Constitution under Article 3. That article gives the Congress the right to create some of the rules of the courts and define what courts we should have, though we have to have a Supreme Court because the Constitution says we have to have a Supreme Court. It's in Article 6 that the Constitution declares, rather, that the Constitution itself declares that this Constitution will be the supreme law of the land, and state judges will be obligated, now I'm going to not quite quote it, obligated to enforce it, anything in the laws or constitutions of their states to the contrary notwithstanding. So at that point, it looks pretty much like it's going to be the state judges are going to be responsible for this. But the first Congress of the United States is made up largely of framers. James Madison's and a lot of the people who framed the Constitution are in that Congress. And they immediately create the federal court system, the way they're authorized to do by Article 3. And as part of that system, they create a method for appealing decisions from state court judges to the Supreme Court if the state court judge has been presented with the argument that a state law is unconstitutional, but that state judge said, no, I don't agree, I think the state law is constitutional. Of course, what they saw was that the real danger, that some states would go one way, some states would go another way, and you'd have total chaos in the system, and that it would still be the states that decided what the Constitution meant. So they provided for an appeal and conditions like that to the Supreme Court. And that's where the federal courts got their right to hear that kind of case. Why weren't they more active? Well, how are you supposed to decide Baron versus Baltimore? Baron versus Baltimore is a case where a guy owns a wharf in Baltimore and the city silts in, or actually makes a channel that silts in his wharf, and he can't use it anymore. And he says, you're taking my property without due process of law, and that violates the Bill of Rights. And he goes to the courts and says, tell them the law is no good. And there's the Supreme Court saying to itself, well, if we decide that the Bill of Rights means that no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and say that, boy, they got to do something about this guy's wharf, what does it mean for slavery? What does it mean for all those laws that deprive black Southerners of liberty without due process? They're not going to do it. And they knew they were not supposed to do it. And there was a perfectly obvious solution in the Constitution itself, which was that the Bill of Rights, they said, and probably they were right, was meant to limit the federal government, not the states. And that's, I think, the real reason, not the lack of court, not the formal lack of a statement in our Constitution that the courts have the power or responsibility of enforcing rights.
Hi, I know mainly your area of expertise is during the Civil War era and Reconstruction, but in your own personal opinion, how do you see this power of the Supreme Court favoring between two of the political parties, of Democrats and Republicans? How do you see them viewing it? Does one support it over another, or does one more strongly and more publicly oppose it?
Are you talking about the parties or the...
Yes, how the parties view this clause and this power of the Supreme Court.
Well, the Republican Party over the last 20 years or so has very much become, in its own view, the party of the Constitution. We don't read platforms the way we used to, the way they did in those days. But the 2012-2016 Republican platform says explicitly that they intend to restore constitutional government to the United States. And they also say explicitly that the United States Supreme Court has failed to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and they promise to appoint judges that will uphold the Constitution of the United States. So the Republican Party is in a somewhat anomalous position, and they're doing exactly what they promised to do. Once they have control, will they now turn around and say, oh, well, the Supreme Court gets to say, is the final say, and whatever the conservative Supreme Court that we're creating says the Constitution means is what it's going to mean? Temptation is going to be very strong for them to do that. But they haven't done it yet. The Democratic Party has said very little about the Constitution. My own view is, as a constitutional historian, that's a great weakness on their part, that the Republicans have been able to claim they're the party of the Constitution and that the Democrats aren't. Is that okay? Great.
My questions kind of goes along with his question. So because what your last point about basically people are more concerned with winning seats on the Supreme Court now instead of being more concerned with just voting in general in regards to like normal Senate and House and people. What do you think can be done with that? Because I agree with you. I think that, I mean, it's really important, obviously, because the Supreme Court is going to be what, I guess, affects our rights as Americans throughout the entire next coming years. And because that balance is shifting, could be bad or good depending on your political views. But how are people supposed to fight that, I guess?
Well, I'm not sure it's a matter of fighting, although there are ways to fight. But it's not certain that a fight is necessary. The Supreme Court and all the justices, it's amazing, I've spoken to bunches of them, they all agree that they have this responsibility and the Constitution is what they say it is. And everybody else is supposed to accept that, Congress and the President. But then things are going to turn an awful lot about what they do say the Constitution means. And the court is affected by the context of the times. The Supreme Court that upheld the slaveholding Constitution was upholding a general popular view of the Constitution. They weren't contradicting it. For a brief time, they tried to uphold that old view of the Constitution against a rising new anti-slavery view. And it created a crisis. They gave the Dred Scott decision. The Republican Party ignored the Dred Scott decision. We fought a civil war in part because of the Dred Scott decision. Courts understand their limitations. And this Supreme Court that we are liable to get if present nominee is confirmed, is going to be a very extreme, a very conservative court, as long as it appears that the public as a whole and the sentiments of the country are conservative. And they will carry that conservatism on beyond the level of what the masses of people generally believe, as long as they feel they have general support. That happened during the Civil Rights era. The Warren Court took civil liberties way beyond what the ordinary person conceived of them. But the ordinary person did conceive that segregation was wrong, did conceive that people ought to have freedom of speech. So that's what the court actually does in our environment. So the best thing, if you don't like what the court's going to do, vote for the people who don't agree with that philosophy of the Constitution. The court will adjust itself. Oh, now hands like crazy.
Hi, I just want to know, like, would you think that John C. Calhoun would be partially responsible for the start of the seceding of the Union, even though in the 1830s he left the vice presidency for the Senate for like a with all like the money stuff and all that? Like, would you think that he's partially responsible for everything that happened the next 30, 40 years after?
Well, he bears a responsibility in the sense that historians are always looking for causes, and his argument, he was the most brilliant constitutional theorist of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And he created, in many ways, the constitutional argument that argued that the Constitution actually was based on state sovereignty rather than any kind of national sovereignty. And that position gained a good deal of adherence in the South. But most of all, when Southerners decided that the Constitution itself was being violated by Northerners, that philosophy, that understanding of the Constitution was there to adopt, and Southerners did adopt it. So from that standpoint, he bears that responsibility. One should always remember, he's a very interesting character, that he knew what was going to happen. He knew that if Northerners tried to transform the country to a free republic, that there would be a breakup of the Union. And all his life, he loved the Union. The only thing he loved more than the Union, or as much, was slavery itself. So when he tries to persuade Northerners to accept a pro-slavery Constitution, he is trying to save the Union. But it's the Union as he knows it, the pro-slavery Union.
I'm intrigued by your notion that the solution to disagreement with the Supreme Court is through citizen action and elections. We have just seen in the last few years, and your notion that the Supreme Court follows popular, or at least fundamental values.
It's limited by popular fundamental values.
Well, I don't think most people in this country think dollar bills, $100 bills, $1,000 bills are equivalent to First Amendment speech. Yet this Supreme Court has equated or adopted rules that I think the vast majority of people in this country disagree with, that you can't limit spending on elections. This Supreme Court currently, before whatever happens with Kavanaugh, has certainly making big signs that gerrymandering may survive even a constitutional challenge. And then, of course, we have not the Supreme Court's fault, but the original founders' fault with the whole question of the Electoral College. What is your view of what people should do if that trend, and if Kavanaugh gets through and he joins that trend, and basically limits the ability of working men and women in this country of being able to have their votes count?
Well, as I said, my own view, my first view is that public opinion in this country, and I mean public constitutional opinion, when we finally think about what the Constitution means and ought to mean, constrains the court. That's my point of view, and I think history has shown it, but of course it's possible, and more possible now when there's such a strong feeling among the justices that they are the people with the final say. Even the liberals say that when you talk to them. That is more dangerous now than it might have been before, because they may not feel that they ought to be constrained by popular opinion things. That's a danger. That might happen. There are lots of ways for an aroused public that feels that its constitutional understandings are being usurped by a court to deal with the court. Right now, nobody wants to do it. At this moment, if you say things like pack the court, which Congress absolutely has the right to do, I will tell you one thing. Unfortunately, I don't have a pipeline of people in Congress, but I was very upset, not on political grounds, though I did share about what happened to Merrick Garland. I thought that was fundamentally unconstitutional. To Merrick Garland, when President Obama nominated with a year to go in his term a Supreme Court justice, and the Republicans would not even hold hearings. That I thought was fundamentally unconstitutional. Congress can immediately vote to add a 10th seat to the Supreme Court to counteract that result, the fact that he was not put in. We'll see if they do it. This is not on anybody's mind right now, but there's that, absolutely. You can change the pension system to really encourage Supreme Court justices to retire and not stay on until they have to be carried out feet first. There's a lot of things you can do. And then finally, of course, in the end, if things get bad enough, there is constitutional amendment, but that's the hardest thing. But the court's not going to stand up to an aroused Congress. It can't. Did I see some other?
Take two more. We're going to one here, and then we're going to go over there. No. You don't? Okay.
Somebody had their hands up right there.
Though, that if you want to stay and talk about this, we are going to relocate to the far wing, so you can't have a dialogue. Yep. But we'll go with a few more questions to the large crowd and let those people want to go along.
Yes.
We will continue the dialogue. One of them.
Professor, I'm worried about the status of civil rights in the country. Do you think the greatest threat is kind of presaged in the Masterpiece Cake case, where someone's religious beliefs can trump civil rights laws?
Of course, there's the immediate point of your question, which is, again, that the Supreme Court is interpreting the Constitution and thinks it has the final right to interpret the Constitution, and that we are all bound by that decision. And in this case, the Supreme Court decides that people have either a First Amendment freedom of religion right or a kind of free speech right to decide when you're an artist who you are going to use your art for. It's not quite as easy a question as it appears on the surface, really. But the fact still is that the court is reacting. It isn't the court. The Supreme Court put the nail in the coffin of laws that prevented people of the same sex from signifying their love and permanent relationship by getting married. That was a court case. How many of you think that court case would have been decided the way it was if there hadn't been a sea change in American attitudes towards homosexuality and gay marriage? Who's really responsible for that change? I think you have to see, as the abolitionists certainly saw, that the Constitution is the responsibility of all of us. And it's going to be all of us who are going to make these decisions. It would be well if the political parties, instead of insulting each other, would talk about what their constitutional philosophies were, how they would carry them out if they were elected, and let the American people decide. I happen to be a progressive in these areas. Other people here may be conservatives. We have to have faith in the American people. We have to have faith that our ideas of these things are the correct ones, and that the American people are going to see that they're the correct ones. Then we'll deal with 9 people who decide that the American people are wrong.
First, I have a disclaimer. I'm not a history major. I was an English major. So we love them. So I'm wondering about some wording. I've heard you use 2 phrases. Life, liberty, and property. And then you've also used life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we hear a lot more commonly right now. How does that relate? The property I see to the 14th amendment relating. But how and when did this common change come about?
Well, Jefferson decided to use the language, and he was ratified in his use of it by the Style Committee, pursuit of happiness instead of property. He was summarizing very concisely what John Locke had said about the natures of government and the nature of the purpose of government, which was absolutely accepted among Americans as fundamental. He wrote pursuit of happiness instead of property because Jefferson's a genius, and he understands that what's really at stake here is how to make people feel self-fulfilled, and it doesn't have to be property. Well, most of us are not geniuses that way, and our heritage is from Britain is the notion of life, liberty, or property, that cannot be taken away with you without the judgment of your peers or by the laws of the land, and that has continued to carry most of the what I would call literary weight. When the state constitutions wrote their bills of rights, when the framers of the Constitution wrote our Bill of Rights, they had the choice between which language to use, and they chose property. It also may be that if you think of law, property has more substance. Law knows and defines property. It's treated in a bunch of ways. If you say you're going to protect it, you know what you're protecting. Pursuit of happiness doesn't have a legal definition. It would be very hard to figure out what you're going to protect that way.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. Now, you already know in what high regard I hold this man.
But
I disagree with what you said about the Supreme Court representing popular constitutionalism, or that they see themselves restrained by what people think. Dred Scott, that declared no Negro was a citizen of the United States, but then went on to, instead of just dismissing the case because it had no jurisdiction, went on to adopt Calhoun's radical Southern view that the Fifth Amendment meant Southern slave owners had the absolute constitutional right to take their slaves into every territory. That was not mainstream popular constitutionalism. It went against moderates in the South. We're still willing to accept popular sovereignty. Let the people decide. That was the radical minority view of the South. So how was popular constitutionalism at all a restraint? The notion, they were not restrained at all. How was the Dred Scott court restrained?
I've got my own.
Never mind.
My own mic.
No, I want to have two mics. They weren't. That if the Supreme Court, my point is that that's unusual. We don't consider the Dred Scott decision to be the typical decision of the Supreme Court. I know, that's what our future will be.
Well, that's what we have to see. And there's no. My prediction is based on my understanding of the past. The fact is that has only limited predictive value. And as I said, the present Supreme Court absolutely thinks that they have this right. The common view among lawyers still, but certainly on the court, is that there is a distinction between law and politics, and a distinction especially between constitutional law and politics. The court declares what the constitutional law is. That sets the boundaries within which the president, the Congress, and the state legislatures can act. Within those boundaries, they can do anything they want, but they can't cross the boundaries, and the court sets the boundaries. That's the dominant view. And the view, that I'm articulating is that's not the way it works. That we're constantly talking about the Constitution in Congress. We're constantly talking about the Constitution for the presidency. We're constantly talking about the Constitution on the stump. They don't have that. Our politics is suffused with constitutionalism. And if they think they can make that kind of a distinction where they're going to be the boss of the one, and all the rest of us are going to say, oh, really? Okay, we're sorry. We thought we knew what we were talking about, but I guess we don't. I don't think that's likely to be the future course of the country. There's going to be horrible shocks and pain while the court learns that, if the court doesn't learn it. But in the end, it's not going to be the court that's going to come out on top.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think we should thank Professor Benedict.
It's a pleasure, great pleasure. Thank you for the questions.